She spent a lifetime saving memories for her children, hoping her last gift would bring them closer. But when the moment came, their response shattered everything she believed about family. Margaret Collins woke before dawn, her mind already swirling with lists and unfinished tasks. The house was hushed, only the distant hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the mantel clock filled the silence. She sat for a long moment at the edge of her bed, hands folded, as if steeling herself for the day ahead. Sunrise was Margaret's favorite time. She brewed a pot of strong tea and set it on a tray beside a single slice of her homemade apple bread. While the tea steeped, she gazed through the kitchen window at her garden, the peonies trembling with dew. It was spring, her last spring in the house she'd called home for 42 years. Margaret's hands trembled as she retrieved a small cedar keepsake box from the top of her wardrobe. She placed it gently on the kitchen table and ran her fingers over the inlaid design, a delicate pattern of lilies and vines. Inside were mementos gathered over decades, locks of baby hair tied with ribbon, hand-drawn cards from childhood birthdays, a pressed corsage from prom night, a faded photograph of the whole family at the lake. Each item was labeled in Margaret's neat, flowing script. After breakfast, she began the bittersweet task of sorting her possessions for the move to the retirement cottage across town. She filled boxes with books, winter coats, and embroidered linens, some to be donated, some to be given to friends. But the keepsake box was different. This was her last gift, one she had crafted carefully for her children, Anna, Mark, and David. She set out 3 letters, each addressed in her hand, and began writing anew. For Anna, she recounted late-night talks over tea, memories of mother-daughter picnics, and the first day Anna left for college. For Mark, she described learning to ride a bike, the camping trips, his wild curiosity that sometimes left her both exasperated and delighted. For David, the youngest, she wrote of art projects at the kitchen table, his shyness at school, and his way of making the whole family laugh. Margaret included tokens in each envelope, an old locket for Anna, a fountain pen for Mark, a hand-carved chess piece for David. Each had its story, its own quiet meaning. She pressed the letters flat, sealed them, and tucked them into the keepsake box along with the tokens. By late morning, Anna called. "Hi, Mom. I can swing by this afternoon. Just a quick visit. I have a meeting at 2. Margaret's heart squeezed, but she masked her longing. "That would be lovely, dear. I'll have tea ready." She spent the next hour tidying, dusting the family photos on the mantel, fluffing the pillows on the living room sofa. She placed the keepsake box in the center of the dining table, hoping the weight of her intention, her love, would be felt. Anna arrived in a hurry, hair pulled back, car keys jangling in her hand. She embraced Margaret quickly, glancing at her phone. "Sorry, Mom, I can't stay long." "What's this?" Margaret smiled, inviting her to sit. "It's something special I've made for you and your brothers. I hope it reminds you of all the good times we've shared." Anna opened the box, sifting through the letters and small tokens. She seemed distracted, barely reading the letter before tucking it into her purse. "That's sweet, Mom. I really have to run. Maybe Mark and David will have more time." After Anna left, Margaret tried not to dwell on the sense of anticlimax. She called Mark, who promised to visit soon, though his voice was full of background noise, children yelling, a dog barking, television blaring. David, when she finally reached him, was polite but distant, offering to swing by sometime next week if work calms down. Margaret placed the keepsake box back on the table, staring at it as the afternoon faded into dusk. She made herself a simple supper, set out a plate for one, and listened to the quiet hum of the house she'd filled with love for so many years. When darkness settled, she carried the box upstairs, tucking it gently into her suitcase with a prayer that her gift would be received, if not now, then someday. As she prepared for bed, Margaret paused at the threshold of each room, lingering over the details: a quilt she'd sewn for Anna's wedding, a painting Mark had made in high school, the dent in the baseboard from David's skateboard. The memories clung to her, bittersweet and sharp. She fell asleep that night, alone but hopeful, her last gift packed away, waiting for the children whose lives had once filled every corner of her heart. The next day, Margaret rose early, her mind churning with what she'd left unsaid. The house seemed emptier now, stripped of the anticipation that had buoyed her through the long winter. She busied herself with chores, wiping down kitchen counters, organizing recipe cards, and packing up her sewing supplies. She made sure to dust the keepsake box before placing it back on the dining room table, just in case Mark or David arrived unannounced. Mid-morning brought a knock at the door. Margaret's heart fluttered. She smoothed her hair and opened the door to find Mark, her middle child, with his 2 young sons in tow. The boys burst past her, trailing crumbs from breakfast and laughter in their wake. Mark looked tired, distracted, his phone buzzing incessantly. Margaret led them to the living room, where she'd set out a plate of cookies and a pitcher of lemonade. The boys squabbled over the last oatmeal raisin, while Mark scanned his emails, answering her questions with distracted half-smiles. When the commotion settled, Margaret presented the keepsake box. She explained its purpose, opening the lid and placing Mark's letter and fountain pen in his hand. Mark flipped through the letter, glancing at the pen with polite curiosity. "Thanks, Mom. This must be from Grandpa, right?" Margaret nodded, her heart lifting at the recognition. "Yeah, I remember you kept his things. Nice to have it." He tucked the pen in his pocket, folding the letter without reading it fully. The boys grew restless, tugging at Mark's sleeve. "We gotta go, Mom," Mark said, gathering his sons and glancing at his watch. "Soccer practice. We'll catch up later, okay?" Margaret smiled bravely, walking them to the door and pressing kisses onto the boys' foreheads. She watched their car disappear down the street, the ache in her chest settling deeper. She spent the afternoon repotting her violets, hands working through the soil as her mind circled the visit. She replayed Mark's distracted thank you, wondering if her effort to reach her children had landed anywhere at all. She brewed tea and sat by the window, the keepsake box now minus 1 letter and 1 pen. David called just after 3, his voice cheerful but distant. "Sorry, Mom. I'm swamped. Maybe I can swing by next week? Is there anything urgent?" Margaret wanted to say yes, to invent a crisis just to bring him closer, but she only replied, "No, nothing urgent. Just wanted to see you." As evening fell, Margaret set the table for 1. She ate slowly, savoring the quiet. After dinner, she took a walk through the neighborhood, pausing to chat with Mrs. Burnett about the new neighbor's garden and the weather's slow shift toward warmth. Back home, she found Anna's letter unopened on the sideboard. Margaret debated calling her daughter, but remembered Anna's hurried goodbye. Instead, she wrote a new letter, one she didn't intend to send. In it, she described the feeling of packing away a life, the small pride of holding on to love even when it isn't returned in kind. Before bed, Margaret tidied the guest room, making sure the extra blanket was folded neatly at the end of the bed. She pressed the pillow, imagining Anna staying over as she had during college breaks, laughter drifting from the kitchen after midnight snacks. The house felt impossibly large, the rooms echoing with memories Margaret wasn't sure she'd ever recapture. She placed the keepsake box at her bedside and turned out the light, whispering a promise into the darkness, that she would keep loving, even if her gifts went unopened, even if her children never truly saw what she was offering. By the end of the week, Margaret's home buzzed with preparations for her farewell luncheon. The church ladies had insisted on helping, bringing casseroles and fresh bread, while Margaret baked her signature lemon cake, Anna's favorite, or so she remembered. She polished the silver, ironed the tablecloth, and arranged wildflowers in mason jars for every table. The luncheon was set for Saturday afternoon. By noon, the kitchen was warm with laughter and the scent of baked ham and cinnamon rolls. Margaret wore her best blue dress, the one she'd saved for special occasions, and pinned a brooch Anna had made in elementary school to her collar. Guests began to arrive in clusters. Mrs. Burnett with her carrot salad, Dorothy from next door bearing apple pie, friends from Margaret's book club, and 2 of Mark's children, shepherded by their mother. The house filled with voices, old stories, shared jokes, memories from the decades Margaret had lived there. Anna arrived late, her arms full of paperwork, her phone pressed to her ear. She kissed Margaret's cheek absent-mindedly before stepping outside to take a call. Mark and David showed up together, David in a hurry, Mark juggling his boys and a casserole dish. They hugged Margaret and complimented the food, but soon drifted into conversations with other guests, always half listening, always glancing at their watches. During lunch, Margaret made a short speech, thanking everyone for the kindness and friendship that had shaped her life in the neighborhood. Her voice trembled, but she smiled, raising a glass of lemonade to the future. The church ladies clapped, her children nodded politely. After dessert, Margaret called Anna, Mark, and David into the living room. She presented the keepsake box again, encouraging them to open their envelopes, to see what she had saved and written for each of them. Anna sat at the edge of the sofa, reading a few lines before setting her letter aside to answer a work email. Mark examined the chess piece, shrugged, and tucked it into his jacket. David offered a quiet, "Thank you, Mom," but his eyes never left his phone screen. The room felt strangely empty even as it buzzed with conversation. Margaret noticed her children gathered in a corner, discussing logistics, her move, storage for furniture, plans for dividing family heirlooms. Their voices were low and practical, focused on the future rather than the memories Margaret had tried so carefully to honor. The luncheon drew to a close. Friends hugged Margaret tightly, some with tears, others with laughter. The children kissed her goodbye, promising to visit her new cottage soon. Anna, Mark, and David offered quick hugs, then slipped out to their cars, busy lives pulling them away once again. When the house was finally quiet, Margaret wandered from room to room, gathering plates and empty glasses. She paused at the mantel, running her fingers over the family photos lined up in a careful row. In the soft golden light, she saw every version of her children, laughing, playing, posing in holiday sweaters, and wondered where those years had gone. She set the keepsake box back on the table, its contents now incomplete, its meaning heavy. She carried it to her room, placed it gently in her suitcase, and sat on the edge of her bed, listening to the ticking clock and the distant sound of a dog barking down the street. Night settled over the house. Margaret drifted into uneasy sleep, the echo of her own voice, her gratitude, her longing, her love, lingering in the air like a quiet prayer unanswered. Margaret awoke before sunrise, her mind heavy with the weight of yesterday's gathering. The house, once so full of laughter and movement, now echoed with silence. She sat on the edge of her bed, looking at the packed boxes and the suitcase with her keepsake box inside. Her hands shook as she made morning tea, the mug warming her palms but not reaching the chill inside. The movers were due by mid-morning. Margaret wandered from room to room, pausing in each space, lingering over the spots where life had unfolded. Anna's childhood drawings still taped to the laundry room wall, the measuring marks on the doorframe showing how tall the children had grown year by year. She ran her fingers along the banister, remembering the squeals of children racing down to Christmas morning. When the movers arrived, she offered them coffee and directed them with gentle authority. Each piece of furniture was handled with care, but Margaret saw her life's memories being loaded into a van: her grandmother's rocking chair, the family piano, boxes of books marked with careful handwriting. She watched the emptying of her home with a quiet ache. Anna stopped by briefly, dropping off documents about the retirement cottage. She spoke in brisk tones, discussing lease agreements and insurance, not pausing to look around or to see the marks on the doorframe. Margaret tried to draw her in, offering a slice of lemon cake, but Anna refused, glancing at her watch. "I've really got to run, Mom. The kids need picking up." She kissed Margaret's cheek, barely touching, and hurried out. Later, Mark arrived to help with the garage. They worked together in companionable silence, sorting tools, sweeping the floor, stacking boxes. Mark found his old baseball glove, handed it to Margaret with a shrug. "Don't suppose the grandkids will want this, but you should keep it. Just in case." Margaret tucked it into a box labeled Memories, her heart squeezing at his indifference. David didn't come, but he called just as the movers finished. "Hope everything's going smoothly, Mom. Sorry I couldn't be there. Crazy day at the office." Margaret tried to keep her voice bright. "Everything's fine, darling. I'll see you soon." By afternoon, the house was nearly bare. The sun streamed through clean windows onto empty floors. Margaret made one last sweep through each room, saying goodbye in a whisper. Goodbye to the kitchen where she'd taught Anna to bake bread, to the living room where Mark and David had built pillow forts, to the backyard where family barbecues had stretched into twilight. She met the movers at the curb, locking the door behind her with a shaking hand. The key felt heavier than it should have. She left it in the mailbox for the new owners, then climbed into the passenger seat of the moving van for the short ride to her cottage. The retirement cottage was small and neat, with a tidy lawn and a cheerful welcome mat. Inside, Margaret directed the movers, asking them to place her things carefully: the rocking chair by the window, the piano near the bookshelf, the keepsake box on her new bedside table. When the movers left, Margaret unpacked slowly. She placed family photos on a narrow shelf, spread her favorite quilt on the bed, and arranged her violets on the sunny windowsill. She set the keepsake box in the center of her new room, its lid still closed. That evening, Margaret made a simple dinner and ate by the window, watching the sun set over unfamiliar rooftops. The cottage was quiet. No footsteps upstairs, no laughter in the yard, just the gentle hum of her own breath. Before bed, she opened the keepsake box and read the letter she had written, running her fingers over the tokens meant for her children. She closed the lid gently, tears sliding down her cheeks, not for what she had lost, but for all she had tried to give. Margaret lay awake a long time, listening to the new sounds of her life, the distant murmur of neighbors, the soft sigh of the wind in the trees. In the darkness, she whispered a blessing for her children, her last gift sent out into the night, hoping it might be felt, if not understood. The days at the cottage unfolded quietly. Margaret woke each morning to birdsong outside her window, sunlight glinting off dew on the grass. She set about making the small space feel like home, arranging her quilts, hanging photographs, and filling vases with wildflowers picked on her morning walks. She met her neighbors, mostly women her age, who stopped by to introduce themselves, bringing homemade bread or jam as tokens of welcome. Despite the gentle bustle of her new surroundings, Margaret felt the absence of her children more sharply than ever. She sent each of them a short message, letting them know she'd settled in and inviting them to visit whenever they liked. Anna replied with a brief text, "Glad you're settled, Mom. Busy week ahead, but we'll try soon." Mark sent a thumbs-up emoji. David didn't answer at all. Margaret kept busy. She joined a knitting circle at the community center, her fingers moving deftly through soft yarn as she listened to stories about grandchildren and family reunions. She volunteered for the garden club, spending afternoons pulling weeds and planting pansies in the shared flower beds. The other residents welcomed her kindly, but Margaret found herself falling silent when talk turned to family, unable to match their easy tales of Sunday dinners and birthday parties. One evening, the cottage hosted a potluck. The dining room buzzed with laughter and the clink of dishes. Margaret brought her lemon cake, placing it on the table alongside casseroles and pies. As she filled her plate, she caught snippets of conversation, plans for holidays, updates on grandchildren's milestones, news of visits and photos exchanged. Margaret smiled and nodded, feeling both seen and invisible at once. After dinner, she walked home alone beneath the streetlights, her heart heavy. She paused by the tiny playground near the cottages, listening to the wind rustle through the swings. For a moment, she closed her eyes and imagined her children. Anna as a little girl begging to be pushed higher, Mark chasing David across the grass, all three of them shrieking with laughter. Back in her room, Margaret opened the keepsake box once more. She read the letters, touched the locket and the chess piece and the pen, and allowed herself to grieve not just the past, but the distance that now seemed to grow with every day. Sunday brought a letter from her old friend Lila, bright news about a wedding in the family, a new baby, an invitation to visit in the fall. Margaret replied warmly, grateful for the simple connection. She spent the afternoon knitting in her chair by the window, watching rain slip down the glass, the quiet broken only by the soft sound of needles clicking together. That night, Margaret dialed Anna's number, longing for the comfort of her daughter's voice. The call rang and rang before going to voicemail. Margaret left a gentle message. No guilt, no pleading, just love. Just wanted to hear your voice, darling. Hope you're well. Call when you can. I love you. She hung up, staring at the phone, then turned off the light. The cottage was still, but for the first time in weeks, Margaret let herself sleep without waiting for the phone to ring. Margaret awoke to a soft knock at the door. It was Mrs. Evans from across the hall, dropping off a tray of scones. They chatted for a while, exchanging news about the garden club and the upcoming bingo night. When Mrs. Evans left, Margaret sat at her small kitchen table, savoring the buttery scones with her morning tea. For a moment, the comfort of company lingered. Inspired, Margaret spent the morning writing letters. She penned a thank-you note to Mrs. Evans, a long reply to Lila, and, after a deep breath, fresh letters to each of her children. These were gentle, hopeful letters, each one different. To Anna, she shared a memory of baking bread together. To Mark, she recounted the time he'd brought home a stray puppy and how it had changed the family's summer. To David, she wrote about his first painting, still hung in her new cottage. In each letter, she avoided guilt or longing, simply offering stories and warmth. She mailed the letters, then stopped by the community center to check the bulletin board, upcoming potlucks, yoga classes, a flyer for a book drive. She signed up for a baking contest, promising to bring her apple bread. Later that afternoon, Margaret called Mark. His wife answered, apologetic but hurried. "Mark's just left for work, Margaret. I'll let him know you called." Margaret thanked her and hung up, staring at the quiet phone. At supper, she prepared a favorite meal, chicken pot pie, the recipe Anna used to request for her birthday. The scent filled the cottage, and Margaret imagined her children sitting at the table, laughter and stories echoing in the cozy space. She ate slowly, each bite a small act of remembrance. After dinner, she knitted in the common room with other residents. The group was lively, full of laughter and gentle teasing. Margaret found herself joining in, telling stories from her own childhood. She noticed how easily she could give comfort to others, even as she longed for it herself. That night, as rain pattered the windows, Margaret checked her phone. No calls, but a single text from Anna. "Thanks for the letter, Mom. Busy as ever, but glad you're doing well. Love you." Margaret smiled, rereading the message. She sent a simple reply. "Love you too. The door is always open." Before bed, Margaret opened the keepsake box, reading through her children's letters again. The tokens nestled inside, untouched by their intended recipients, seemed to hold both sorrow and hope. Margaret placed the box back on her nightstand, pulled the quilt up to her chin, and closed her eyes. The loneliness was still there, but so was a quiet, stubborn gratitude, for every chance she'd had to love, and for every small reply that found its way back home. The week stretched long and slow, each day edged with a longing Margaret had learned to bear. She filled her hours with purpose. There were garden club meetings, where she helped plant marigolds and weed the borders. She won second prize at the baking contest for her apple bread, the judges complimenting its old-fashioned warmth. In the evenings, she joined a circle of residents for bingo or puzzle nights, laughter rising in the small lounge even as Margaret's heart ached quietly beneath the surface. Mail brought a birthday card from Lila and a note from the library. Her favorite author's new novel was ready for pickup. Margaret made the trip after breakfast, stopping at the bakery for a loaf of rye. The librarian, Mrs. Stanton, smiled and asked, "Any visits from your family yet?" Margaret managed a gentle shrug. "Not yet. Maybe soon." She found herself walking past the playground near the cottages, pausing to watch a grandfather push his giggling granddaughter on a swing. Margaret smiled at them, warmth blooming and fading in her chest. At home, Margaret spent an afternoon sorting through her boxes once more. She dusted the keepsake box, checking that the letters and tokens inside were safe. She wrote new postcards to Anna and Mark, brief and bright, sharing a joke from bingo night, a tip for growing better tomatoes, a memory of their childhood summers. David surprised her with a call one evening, his voice upbeat but slightly awkward. "Hi, Mom. Sorry I've been hard to reach. Work's been crazy. How are you settling in?" Margaret's heart lifted. "I'm well, David. I joined the garden club and started knitting again. How are you?" They spoke for almost 10 minutes, about work, about an upcoming concert, about the rain. David promised to visit when things slowed down. Margaret thanked him, savoring the call long after it ended. On Sunday, the community hosted a potluck picnic. Margaret brought lemon cake and her favorite salad. The air was full of music and chatter. Mrs. Evans insisted on a group photo, and Margaret found herself in the middle, arms wrapped around new friends, smiling genuinely for the first time in days. That evening, Anna sent a photo of her own children, bundled up and smiling after soccer practice. "They say hi, Grandma. Hope we can come see you soon." Margaret replied with a heart emoji and a short message. "Would love that more than anything." As the week drew to a close, Margaret sat by her window in the quiet, reflecting on the rhythms of her new life. The ache for her children was still there, deep and constant, but so was a glimmer of acceptance. Her love persisted, even if it was rarely returned in the way she hoped. She touched the keepsake box, letting her fingers linger over its smooth surface, and whispered a wish into the quiet, that one day her gifts, her stories, her love, her memories, might finally be understood. The days grew longer, sunlight stretching golden across Margaret's cottage floor. She woke each morning to birdsong and made her tea by the window, watching the garden she had helped plant bloom with new color. The ache for her children remained, a quiet, steady presence, but Margaret moved through her days with more gentleness, allowing herself to savor small joys. Neighbors stopped by with jam and stories. Margaret welcomed them, sharing cake and laughter, listening more than she spoke. She found herself telling stories about her children's childhood, how Anna loved to read in the crook of the old willow, how Mark once rescued a stray kitten, how David painted rainbows on every wall he could reach. Her friends listened kindly, never asking for more than Margaret was willing to give. Letters from Anna came, brief but kind, always full of news and photos of the grandchildren. Mark sent a postcard from a business trip, a picture of a lighthouse, a scribbled, "Thinking of you, Mom." David's calls grew more regular, sometimes short, sometimes long enough for laughter. Margaret started hosting Sunday tea for her neighbors. She brought out her best cups and let the house fill with a hum of gentle conversation. Sometimes, in the middle of pouring tea or slicing cake, she would imagine her children at the table with her, and the room seemed fuller, her heart lighter. The keepsake box remained on her nightstand. Some nights, she opened it and reread the letters, touching the locket, the pen, the chess piece. She no longer waited for her children to claim these tokens. Instead, she cherished them for the memories they held, proof of a mother's devotion, whether received or not. On a bright Saturday, Anna and her children finally visited. The cottage rang with laughter and footsteps. The grandchildren explored every room, hugged Margaret tightly, and begged for stories about their mother as a girl. Margaret showed them her garden, baked apple bread, and tucked them into bed with old lullabies. That night, as the cottage quieted, Anna sat with Margaret in the glow of the kitchen lamp. They talked softly, words flowing easier than before. Anna thanked Margaret for her letters and the keepsake box, tears in her eyes as she picked up the locket and pressed it to her heart. Margaret smiled, feeling something ease inside her, a gentle forgiveness, a release. She understood, at last, that her greatest gift had never been the box or the tokens, but the love that endured, quietly, beneath everything. As the house settled into sleep, Margaret climbed into bed, peace blooming softly in her chest. The ache was still there, but so was gratitude, for every moment shared, every memory cherished, and every quiet return of love.